Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz, and we have a very important topic to discuss today. And to do that, we have a man who studied philosophy at the University of Chicago. He's been a writer, lecturer, and commentator for more than 25 years. He's a senior fellow at the Atlas Society, and his new book, which we are going to talk about, is called Dictator from Day One: How Donald Trump is Overthrowing the Constitution and How to Fight Back. Robert Tracinski, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me again.
First question I got to ask, why the provocative title?
I don't think it's a provocative title. I mean, so title, I have to show the book here. Dictator.
Well, provocative doesn't mean untrue.
Well, no, okay. I mean, Dictator from Day One was kind of the obvious title because he actually said himself about a year before he got back in office, he said, somebody asked, would you be, I think Sean Hannity asked him, would you be a dictator? He said, no. Well, on day one, I would be a dictator. And the implication was, only on day one, he would take some extraordinary measures. But, has anybody ever said they're going to be a dictator for just one day and actually followed through on that, right? You seize that kind of power, you're going to seize it beyond one day. And so the dictator on day one was hanging out there. And actually, I wrote for the 100th day in office, in the current term, I wrote an article called Dictator on Day 100, right? So it's playing off of that. And it just seemed like the natural thing to do because it really does fit the facts that I marshaled together in this book, which is that from day one, it's very specifically starting with some very specific executive orders that he gave these sort of unlimited powers to detain people and deport them, like way beyond what the Constitution allows. He has been seizing this unconstitutional, unchecked power. And the overall pattern that I draw in here is he's amassing all power in one person, all power in the person of the president. And that really is the very definition of dictatorship. One person making all the decisions, one person having all the power, and getting rid of any competing institution that could be a check or a limit on that power.
Someone actually asked me yesterday, because I promoted your book on both Facebook and on X, and somebody in a chat asked me on X why I would promote a book with that title, and then they asked me if I thought Trump was a dictator, and my answer was, well, first of all, the title comes from Trump because he said I'll be a dictator on day one. But I also said, but look, I firmly believe if all the guardrails were gone, which Trump seems to be trying to get rid of them all, he would then be a dictator.
Oh, absolutely.
I said, I don't think he's achieved the status yet, but not because of any hesitation on his part. It's just because there still are institutional, restraints. There's some pushback, but he's doing his best to get rid of that.
Well, no dictatorship is ever established exactly in a day, right? It always takes time to assert it and then establish it and then consolidate it and get rid of all the vestiges of the old system that have to be, I've got Star Wars in my head now saying that the last remnants of the old republic have been swept away. The old republic still persists, and we have this in all of our fiction, right? The remnants of the old republic still persists until the emperor dissolves the imperial senate and you finally have the full dictatorship. And so that's what's contained in my subtitle, which is How Donald Trump is Overthrowing the Constitution. And so I make a point about, that's in grammatical terms, that's the present imperfect tense. Somebody is doing something. So it's not the past tense. It's not something he has done. It's not the future tense. It's not something he might do or is about to do. It's not some imminent thing that could happen in the future. It's something that is happening now. So it means that the assertion of dictatorship is real and substantial. It is a real thing actually happening in the world, but it is not yet completed. It's in process. And so somebody says, well, if he's a dictator, how can you write a book saying he's a dictator? Well, and people use this as like this great comeback. And I'm like, well, by your logic, the only time I could write this book, it was when I'm already in the concentration camp, right? So, the dictatorship is, like I said, all dictatorships take time to assert and establish and consolidate. And by the way, on this thing of how, if he's such a dictator, how am I free to write this book? If you go to the Amazon site for this book right now, and you look at the reviews, one of the reviews says this is a dangerous book. It's like the a bunch of 5-star reviews and then one 1-star review, and it's somebody saying this is a dangerous book. This is inciting violence by calling Trump a dictator, and therefore this book shouldn't be allowed to be published. So they're already established. This is what they did, by the way. This is something that's actually not in my book because it happened within like 3 or 4 days after I finished writing this. Was they exploited the Charlie Kirk shooting, and they said, well, look, Charlie Kirk was shot because of leftist agitation, and there's no evidence actually that there's any connection to, this guy wasn't a regular reader of the Bulwark who shot Charlie Kirk. There's no evidence of any direct connection there, but they're exploiting it, right? It's a pretext, and they're saying this is because leftists have been mean to conservatives, and it's because of, and they specifically have said, is because people are calling Trump a fascist, that therefore this is inciting violence. And so you get this sort of, this weird catch-22 where it's unfair and dangerous to call Trump a dictator. And if you call him a dictator, then we're going to, prosecute you and throw you in jail for doing it. Right? So, don't call him a dictator or we'll lock you up for your speech. Is quite a sort of self-contradictory mindful to be holding.
Somebody actually said that to me the other day on Facebook because I said Trump is an authoritarian. Mm-hmm. And the person said, that's obviously not true because if it were, you wouldn't be saying it. And I said, look, to me, this is like, and I try to be respectful, but it's an idiotic claim, right? Because first of all, saying he's an authoritarian doesn't mean he currently has all the powers of an authoritarian. Right? It just means if he could, he would. Secondly, the chances of Donald Trump finding out about my post on Facebook are it's close to zero as you can get without being zero. But the other thing was, on a personal note, I spoke out against the prison system while inside it. And I knew there were risks to my safety. So the idea that people won't speak out because of fear, it's just belied by massive amounts of historical evidence of people doing just that. And then, interestingly, one of the guys who called me out on this, he says, you shouldn't say that. He said, you couldn't verify it. And he pissed me off because he was very condescending. He said, let's take this very slow. So I said, why don't you come on my show and we'll debate it? So he came on my show. I proceeded to utterly dismantle him. And I'm not like braggadocious. I mean, anybody that watched this, I wouldn't even have had a debate. He could have just went up there and lost all on his own with the things he was saying. And then it turned into, oh, but it's irresponsible for you to talk this way, along the same lines that you're talking about. And there is a massive push, and it scares me in its scope of what's occurring. Because on the one hand, you have the sort of MAGA influence sphere, which I'm going to get to, out there saying that left rhetoric, they've got to tone down their rhetoric. And at the same time, they're calling people communists and enemies of the people and this and that. And it's clear as day to me that what they're trying to do is neuter opposition so that you cannot speak out because then you're inciting violence. And with Charlie Kirk, as you mentioned in particular, there's a massive attempt right now to mainstream his ideas and shield him from any criticism of the things that he said. In Charlie Kirk's instance, I was listening to his show the other day, and he referred to inner cities as third world racial jungles, right? So... but I can't criticize that because it might incite somebody. It's a very slippery and discussing tactic in my view.
Well, like Charlie Kirk, one of the things that came out in the last year or so is that there was this big thing going around, and he was basically parroting what was going on elsewhere in conservatism about this idea that, well, if I got on a plane and I saw there was a black pilot, I wouldn't get on the plane. Right. Because I would assume this guy's DEI and the plane's going to crash. Now, this is just insane. And it's segregationist. It's like it's the assumption that any black person in any position of authority or responsibility must inherit, could not possibly have earned it, could not possibly be capable. It's outright racist. So the thing about, it's galling that they want to that they want to stop us from criticizing anybody. I mean, I point out that the great contrarian and free speech crusader, what's his name? He wrote the God Is Not Great book. What's his name?
Oh, Christopher Hitchens.
Christopher Hitchens wrote a whole book about how terrible Mother Teresa was, right? So, I mean, somebody who's universally regarded as a saint has actually been canonized as a saint, which is why he wrote the book. He wrote the book because she'd just been canonized as a saint. She's universally regarded as this wonderful person. He wrote a book about how terrible she is, right? So, I don't think anybody should suppress criticism of anybody, no matter how good a person they were. But to have them do it for someone who is as eminently criticizable as Charlie Kirk. So because they don't want us to criticize Charlie Kirk, I have to take just a minute to do it, right? Which is that my angle on him is he was a political entrepreneur. He was a guy who was there to get money and fame by being an advocate for the right, for conservatism, and wasn't that concerned about what the right was, what conservatism was. Whatever was going on, whatever was popular, he was going to be a spokesman for it. And so if you look at his history, he started out as a pretty standard kind of Tea Party guy, very libertarianish, not concerned about gay marriage, not concerned, very sort of broad tent and not making these racial kind of appeals. And this is like, 2013, 2014. This is before Trump comes along, when he's very young. Because he started out, basically as an 18-year-old campus agitator. And then what happens is throughout his career, conservatism changes, right? The right changes. And you've been through that. I've been through that. That my career was, spans right through that area where I was working for a conservative publication at around 2014, 2015. I saw all this change happening up close. I saw people making the decision to go along with it. And everybody who was working in anything having to do with conservatism or the right, I was never conservative. I was working for a conservative publication. Anybody who was in that sort of line of things had to make this decision. There's this direction that the right is going. Do I go along with it? Do I accommodate it? Do I make excuses for it? Do I jump in all on the bandwagon and go straight out to the front, or do I resist? Do I find some way to get out of this? And a lot of us made the decision to resist and to get out and to not go along with that. And Charlie Kirk made the decision just go along with it because he's a political entrepreneur. That's where the money and that's where the audience was. So that we should not be allowed to criticize someone for that. Even if he were a much better person, I think we should be allowed to criticize him. But even it's just galling. But it is, again, pretext is a word that comes up in my book a lot because there's crime in Washington D.C. and that's a pretext for sending in the troops, even if crime's down to its lowest level in about 30 years. The fact that any crime occurs is just, so a lot of people get trapped into having this to be a debate over, well, what about crime in DC? What should we do about it? That's not the point. That's just a pretext. And a lot of stuff here is pretextual. They have a goal they want. And the goal they want is total absolute power wielded by Donald Trump and enforced by sending ICE and sending the National Guard and put basically neutering Congress. I have the whole thing where I described like 5 different major prongs in which they're doing this. They have this goal of total power for Donald Trump and the people around Donald Trump. And a lot of these things, they're just looking for the excuse. And so Charlie Kirk being shot by a crazy person was, or a fanatic or whatever he was the excuse, the pretext that they were using in order to what they really wanted to do was clamp down on free speech. And like you said, if Donald Trump talking about inflammatory speech being bad, I mean, this is like Madonna talking about how there's too much sex out there. I mean, I'm trying to find an analogy.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
That's a good one.
So go ahead.
Well, you say in the book that people talk in terms like we're heading towards a constitutional crisis or we're heading towards a dictatorship. And you make the claim that we're already there. The constitutional crisis is here. Now, put some meat on the bones. Give us, in objectivist terms, give us the concretes that justify the claim.
Exactly. All right. So, well, in the book, I have 5 prongs, and I'm going to sort of briefly summarize what those 5 prongs are. So the first one is the power of the purse being taken away from Congress, and Congress basically being made into irrelevant, being made into a rubber stamp for Trump. And partly he did this politically by, having people be so cowed by him in Congress. Let me give you an example. The 5th District, Virginia, which is where I am now, we have a guy named John McGuire, who's the congressman, and he got the job because what happened is they had a redistricting, and he was put in the same district. He wanted to go up the ladder and become a congressman. He was put in the same district with an existing incumbent Republican, and he beat the incumbent Republican in the primary because he had Trump's endorsement and the other guy didn't. So what Donald Trump has done is he's made basically every Republican congressman is desperate to have the Trump endorsement, Trump's favor, and terrified of not having it. So they are all his rubber stamps. Now, but concretely what he's done there, though, is he has taken away the power of the purse. And I make the argument that that is their actual real function of Doge. Real function of Doge wasn't cutting spending because they actually didn't cut spending. If you look at the numbers, spending this year for the fiscal year in 2025 is higher than it was last year. So they did not actually cut spending. It's probably going down now because of the shutdown, but even that will be relatively small effect. So they did not cut spending. What they actually did was they took the spending decisions away from Congress. They had Elon Musk going out there and deciding what programs, even what agencies are going to exist. You had agencies that are actually mandated by a law passed by Congress, and they zero out the agency and basically eliminate it because on the unilateral decision of the executive. So that's the first big prong, is basically taking power away from Congress, and especially the power of the purse, because if Congress doesn't have that, they really don't have anything. The second prong was the thing he actually did on day one, which is asserting this power to stop, to search, to arrest people, to detain them, to send them off to foreign prisons without any due process, which is what he's done by building up ICE. And then the most recent thing they've done is his rubber stamp Congress passed this giant budget bill that is going to give ICE more funding than the United States Marine Corps. It is more funding than the militaries of many countries around the world. Right. So this is a major escalation in a giant creation of an all-powerful sort of law enforcement. And that is and the power to basically grab anybody off the street at will without due process. And they're expanding that. And now there are a number of other things they're doing to expand on that, which is things like arbitrary and politically motivated prosecutions. So we recently had a U.S. attorney was fired because they said, well, Trump wanted to prosecute James Comey, former director of the FBI. And the person who was the U.S. attorney at the Justice Department in charge of the case said, look, the evidence doesn't support this. I can't bring this case. And so he fired that person and put one of his lackeys in, somebody who had no experience. She's a real estate attorney, put her in, and she brought the charges. Right. And it was clear that she's bringing the charges not because there's a basis for the prosecution, not because there's some sort of overwhelming evidence. She's bringing it because Donald Trump demanded that she do it. So he's basically taken law enforcement and turned it into a mechanism for asserting an unlimited power to punish his enemies. Third prong is what he's doing with the courts, which is where he has I'll just briefly go over, but where he's lied to the court. He has had his Justice Department people lie to the courts, had them withhold information, had them, in some cases, defy court orders, especially when it comes to deporting immigrants and sending them to El Salvador, to this brutal prison, and also trying to undermine the legal profession. This is one of the scariest things to me, is the way that he issued executive orders, basically exacting penalties and retribution on some big law firms that simply because they were representing his political enemies. So the law firm that represents Jack Smith, the former special counsel who was the guy who was prosecuting Trump said, I want to go after that guy. So what he did is he put sanctions against the law firm that was representing Jack Smith. So basically saying, you as a political opponent of mine, you don't have a right to have legal representation. I'm going to punish your law firm just for representing you. And he went after a bunch of other big law firms that have often represented Democrats. And you actually have people who are being targeted by this who are reporting it's hard to find a lawyer because all the best law firms, they're concerned about having the administration be angry at them, so they won't represent me. So this is an attempt to basically eliminate the judicial system as a check on the president, and not just by targeting the judges, but by targeting the lawyers, and basically saying the lawyers, the administration wins 100% of the cases that somebody doesn't dare to file because they're going to be get some sort of retribution against them. The fourth prong is the economy. And this is the one that, from the perspective of classical liberals and free marketers, this is the thing that I think is most surprising, because you had a lot of people say, well, look, Trump's really bad, but he's going to be pro-capitalist. He has not been pro-capitalist.
No.
He is very much, he's in favor of the idea of an economy personally managed by him, with him setting tariff rates every day. Great example of this, he just put on $100,000 fee on H-1B visas. And these are the skilled, talented workers, computer programmers and scientists and what have you, coming from overseas. You have to pay $100,000 fee. Now, he has no statutory basis for doing this, by the way. This is all purely arbitrary. It's a power he's asserting that does not exist anywhere in the law. But then he said, this is the crucial part. He said, not only am I going to put this $100,000 fee on, which would make it impossible for a lot of companies to afford to hire these people. He said, I can waive the fee if I decide to. So what does that mean? It means if you have a tech company, you have a lot of H-1B visas, you had better be on Donald Trump's good side, because otherwise he's going to impose this fee on you. But if he likes you, he'll waive the fee. So he has this, he has made sure he has as much power over the economy as possible, so that he has this sword to hold over people's heads, this hammer that comes down on somebody if they tick him off. And so this is his way of punishing his enemies and rewarding his allies. And by the way, there's a lot of official corruption that goes in on that as part of that. And then the last prong is really the way he is trying to assert power over all of civil society, over everything outside of there's this whole area. Civil society is a term political scientists use for this whole area of the world that's sort of in between government and the individual. It's all the private associations, all the different ways in which individual people gather together to work together for some goal independent of the government. And civil society is hugely important because it's how we have a lot of power that's out there in the system, a lot of organization, a lot of people working together without the government being involved. It's an independent source of power and influence that the government doesn't control. And he's been trying to get out there and get his tentacles in civil society. And he's doing that, that's part of the implication of this thing about going after the law firms and the lawyers. But he's also doing it now with the universities. And, there's a sort of a chicken coming home to roost there, that the universities have become extremely dependent on government funding. And now he's saying, well, I'll withhold this funding. I'll impose conditions on you. I'll make you do this and make you do that. And he's offering them now a compact where they will basically be his pets, that they will curry favor with the president in exchange for money, federal money. And so this is, but he's doing it. I mean, banners big and small. You may have seen the whole thing over the Cracker Barrel logo, right? So
oh my God,
this changes this logo, and Donald Trump has to weigh in on this and claim credit for getting them to change their decision and all of that. And this is an example of him, wanting to be, I call him, Charlie Sykes used a great phrase that I use called the emperor of everything. He wants to be the guy who, we're having the Olympics. He's going to be chair of the Olympics. He's going to tell us how we're going to do the Olympics. We have the Kennedy Center, this big performing arts thing in DC. He's going to be chairman of the Kennedy Center and telling people who gets Kennedy Center honors and who doesn't. Every little thing inside, the fact that, so my wife's complaining about the cover of this because, the cover has Donald Trump's mug on it. And she's just like, I just don't want to have to see that face all the time, every day, and hear that voice and hear that name. And that is really, this all pervasiveness is part of what happens in an authoritarian system, right? That you never get away from the face and the influence and the opinions of the one central guy at the center of everything. So those are the 5 prongs.
So I had I've had a lot of these, but I had an experience recently on Facebook where my cousins and a good friend who are big Trump guys, they come on my Facebook page and they want to start an argument with me because of something I said about Trump. Normally, I will get into it with people like that. But when it was my cousins and my friends, I asked them nicely, listen, please don't put me in this position. And what I meant was, you're putting me in a position to make fools out of you because you really don't know what you're talking about. You don't know much about politics, the Constitution. You got involved in politics with Trump. And the main thing is, and what they don't get, is that they're being fed lies by a MAGA information system that is unconcerned with truth. And how quickly this spreads, the disinformation. The other, maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks, I don't know, my sense of time is a little off, but John Solomon wrote an article in the morning. And the article said that it's come to light that there were 174, I think it was, FBI agents embedded in the crowd on January 6th. This spread so rapidly, and then I happened to come across, and I thought at first, wow, that's crazy, because I looked up John Solomon because I don't know much about him, and it said he's basically a credible reporter, but he leans right, and so I'm thinking, well, I found that out, so, but then I saw a post from Richard Hanania, and it says these guys got there afterwards.
Yeah, these are the people sent to investigate and to clamp down on it.
Because it happened after the violence. So then I actually went and read the article from John Solomon. And even in the article, it said that the FBI agents got there after the violence occurred. So then I got into an argument with Grok, the AI thing on Twitter, X, because Grok says, no, there was no mention of this, of the FBI agents coming afterwards. It turned out that in his original article, he didn't mention that the FBI agents got there afterwards. He changed it once he was called out for it. But that did not cause, I think the vice president, senators were posting this out, all kinds of MAGA influencers. This thing spread like wildfire throughout the entire MAGA universe about how these guys were embedded in the crowd. And when it was pointed out, there were a few of them who then switched the argument around. Yeah, but they shouldn't have been sent there for riot control. That's not part of their job. Okay, but even if that's true, which I don't know enough about it to know, that's not the same thing as claiming they were there in the beginning to incite. Right. They were sent afterwards to control. But my ultimate point here is that these MAGA information systems are so wide and so far flung. It's a difficult thing to combat when people have no regard for truth and will just continually every single day pump the airwaves with, I don't know if the airwaves is even the proper term at this point, but all the internet, the social media with pure bullshit. What are your thoughts on that aspect of the Trump authoritarian phenomenon?
Yeah. This is how Trump came to exist and be in power in the first place. Is it is absolutely because of this phenomenon. And the way fake news usually works is exactly how you're talking about, that you have someone who is a little more mainstream. I wouldn't try to describe John Solomon as credible because he's done this a lot, right? This is not out of character for him to do something like this. But you get somebody who will report an actual fact, but they'll report it in a way that is very obviously misleading, right? So there'll be some factual basis that is twisted or distorted to mean the opposite of what it actually means. In this case, you say, oh, they're embedded in the crowd, which is 100%, 180 degrees different from they arrived afterwards to investigate and to clamp down on the thing. All right, so they'll report this factoid. I think factoid is actually, that's a literal, accurate, technical use of the term factoid. The factoid was coined to refer to that this very phenomenon of taking something that has a factual basis, but is taken, is taken in a way that distorts its meaning. So this distorted fact, they report that, it goes around everywhere, and then later on they put in the qualifier. Or they write a headline that makes it seem like they've got a much more juicy and salacious fact. And then you go read the body of the article and you realize they can't back up the headline. but they create something that just can be shared, can go viral, can go around, and it's spread everywhere, and everybody gets their prejudices validated, right? Everybody in your in-group gets their prejudices validated. And this is how this fake news stuff works. And it comes from the fact that I think we really have to view Trump not as a normal political movement, but almost as a religious movement, because it has that same character of people want to believe. They want to believe. And, if you've ever argued with a creationist, you've probably experienced this, right? They have something they believe, not because there's evidence, not because there's arguments, but because it is an article of faith with them. And so you can go back and forth on the arguments, and you'll get this situation, just exactly what you're describing, where they make an argument, you come up with a counter argument, and then the argument just sort of mutates. They mutate the argument to something else, which wasn't the original. They don't say, "Oh, I was wrong on the original thing." They just mutate it to something else that's easier to defend, and then you go after that, and it mutates to something else. And it's because the arguments change, but the belief remains the same, and that is a religious, that is a faith-driven entity. Now, we're not used to, in America, we're used to faith-driven causes being built around, actual traditional faiths. And, the conservatives claim, or used to claim, that's what they were for. They were preserving Christianity or whatever. That they were it was based on their Christian faith. But what's happened is that fervor, that religious fervor, has been transferred from the actual religion onto a person, a single person. And that's the other thing that, really makes this, kind of gives it the characteristic, the substantial character of an authoritarian movement, is this idea of the cult of personality, the religious fervor being transferred onto a person. Donald Trump must be defended at all costs. And even like that thing about January 6th. These are the people saying January 6th was great. There was nothing that was wrong. Was that it was a day of love. So they'll defend what happened at January 6th. And then they'll turn around and say, oh, but the whole thing was staged by the FBI to make Trump look bad. Right? So it's two totally contradictory ideas being held together at the same time. And that is the characteristic of a sort of fanatical religious, a kind of religious fanaticism that people have about this.
Yeah, January 6th has morphed, depending on the day, from it was a day of love, nothing went wrong, to it was all Antifa, to it was the FBI that did it.
Yeah, Antifa and the FBI are pretty much the same thing.
They're probably, but you hit on something there with the religiosity. Now, I've long noted a connection between religious thinking and conspiracy theories. And I've noticed the same thing with MAGA. And what I mean is there's fail safes. They have guards up so that they never have to actually challenge the belief. So with religion, for instance, I've had a lot of debates with religious people, and they'll do what you said. They'll switch the subject, make ridiculous claims. Like a guy said to me, anytime I've seen creation, something created, I know there has to be a creator. And so I responded to him, okay, but every time I've ever known of a creator, that creator has occupied a physical body with a physical brain, a nervous system, was mortal. And so what are you saying? Does God have a brain? And he says, well, he has spiritual brains. So that's a total non-concept. Or they will say things like the devil is blinding you so that you can't see the truth. Now, there's no way to respond to that, or they'll tell you, we'll disprove God. In the case of a conspiracy theorist, they might say, well, of course, that's what that source is going to say. They're part of the conspiracy. And I've often told the story of a guy I know who once told me that BlackRock, something about BlackRock owning Fox and all the people they own Dominion. So the lawsuit, it was all a conspiracy. So I Googled it, and every source said, no, this is false. So I told him, look, I just Googled it and it said this is false. And he says to me, well, that's because you're using Google. What you need to do is go to DuckDuckGo. So I said, okay. And I went to DuckDuckGo and I found the same information. And I went back to him and I said, look, it tells me the same thing. And he says, yeah, but you have to look further. And I said, okay, so basically what you're telling me is I have to keep looking until I find the answer that you want.
Exactly.
That's what you're telling me to do. So it's a similar dynamic with this.
The evidence fits the theory rather than the theory fitting the evidence.
Right. And so when you argue with the Trumpsters, it's you're getting all your information from the left. Well, actually, I'm not. I'm going by what Trump has actually said. I get my information from a variety of sources, some of which are right, some left, some mainstream. But it doesn't matter. And it's like you have a situation that some of it's bizarre, like this Cracker Barrel thing. Like in the instance of George Floyd, for some reason, they've become wedded to the idea that he must have died of a drug overdose.
Yeah.
I don't know why this has to be the case, but they make it the case. So I've had people say, well, read the autopsy. First of all, I'm not qualified to read an autopsy, and neither are you. Not you personally, but the guy telling me. But the medical experts who have read it have all said he did not die of a drug overdose.
Right.
10 experts testified at trial. The medical examiner that did that analyzed this stuff, a jury found Chauvin guilty. But you have a video. They have this documentary that says, no, Chauvin filed all the protocols. The guy died of a drug overdose. Now, Radley Balco, the journalist, absolutely destroyed this. Destroyed it and showed it was complete bullshit, but they still go with it. And so someone says to me, look at the levels of fentanyl he had in his system. And I said, it's completely irrelevant because you don't know what his tolerance was.
Right.
So there's no way to know that. But it still comes back to they have a source. It doesn't matter whatever other source you get. They have the chosen source that tells them what they want to hear, and that's what they go with it. But that's what we're up against, Robert. So I don't know how to combat that. I don't know what to do because there's no evidence that can be presented that dissuades him.
Well, I think what we are going to have to look for is ways that there are things that will break through that, the hardcore people, the hardcore true believers, you don't reach. I mean, it's very difficult to reach those people. Those are the last people. Those are the last dominoes to fall. I think we have to talk about this in terms of, excuse me, I'm getting over a cold here. So we have to think of this in terms of experience we have from totalitarian regimes in some ways and authoritarian regimes. And so Natan Sharansky, who was a Russian dissident, talked about how, a regime, when you have a regime like that, you have the true believers, the people who buy everything, lock, stock, and barrel. They repeat all the propaganda with, and they're fully wedded and committed to it. But this is always a small minority. This is like 20% of people. And the vast majority of people are what he calls double thinkers. And that is that they kind of have two brains, as it were. They got the one brain that they use to repeat the official line, and the other brain is more reasonable, right? And I think a lot of people that I know are kind of like that in the sense that when he's talking about it's a totalitarian system, he's saying these are people who don't actually agree with all the propaganda, but they're afraid. So because they're afraid, they repeat the right lines in public and save their private thoughts for in private. What I find with something like this, where it's not totalitarian, at least not yet, is that it tends to be more that you have someone who has a politics brain and a normal brain, right? So that a friend, acquaintance, a relative, somebody who can talk like a normal person and think like a normal person on normal topics, but they've got one area of their life where it's walled off and they have a different way of thinking in there. And I think to the extent that somebody has, but those people, I think, retain some connection to the rest of the world and some connection to the people around them. And I think you can chip away at that. And I think you have to search for the way. I mean, this is the big mystery of what we're going to do, right? What we're trying to do right now is we're trying to look for opportunities to find ways to have them sort of break through and say, wait a minute, this isn't what I supported. Now, we're going to have to show some forbearance sometimes because yes, this is what you voted for, right? He was promising to do all this stuff. This is all predictable, but there will be these moments of shock. Because I think what people do is they create a fictional Donald Trump in their heads. A lot of people who want to support him, they create a fictional, just as they create a fictional, they create a fictional world where, you bring up facts and you say, oh, well, he's doing this and he's doing that. And they explain it away. Oh, no, that didn't really happen. And I kept searching. I kept Googling. I kept going on the internet until I found the one article that allows me to believe something different. So they create a fictional world in which he's not doing all these things. And they create a fictional Donald Trump who is unrecognizable from the real one. He's like a man of the people who just, he's a common guy who just, loves the people and only cares about them. He's not corrupt at all. And meanwhile, he's made like $1 billion added to his personal fortune for every month he's been in office. Nobody has ever minted the presidency into as much money as Donald Trump has ever done. So I look for ways to sort of make this so clear to them that it gets harder to evade. And so, for example, the thing that jumps out to me is Donald Trump is a guy who said, "Oh, I'm for you. I'm for the common man. I care about you." And what's one of the very first things he did when he gets into the White House? He says, "I'm going to collect $250 million from my rich friends to create a giant gilded ballroom, that will basically dwarf the White House and be attached to it, a giant gilded ballroom so that rich guys in tuxedos can come here and trade favors." I mean, that is it's a cartoon version of somebody being an elite who doesn't care about the common man. It's a cartoon version of the very elitism these people said that Donald Trump was supposed to be against. So you have to look for these really garish examples. And I think that the other thing that happens is that people are able to have this sort of epistemic bubble they're in, this bubble of everybody thinks the same, because they found a large enough group of people around them who help them reinforce that, who will agree with it. And Facebook that's why you have all these arguments of Facebook, by the way, which is that, Facebook is the place you go to find all your friends on Facebook agree with you on this. And so therefore, they all spread around the same article from John Solomon. And, that reinforces, that's the network the social network that they use to reinforce everything. And so the other thing that will happen is, the hopeful thing I use is that, Donald Trump got 49.8% of the vote. He got a little less than half. So he acts like this is a mandate. He acts like the culture is changing. He acts like he has 60, 65, 80% of the public on his side. He doesn't. He has 40%, and then some other people who got pulled on because they didn't like Kamala Harris. And, I wasn't that hot on Kamala Harris either, so I kind of get that. So he's got 40% of the public. He's got a minority. It's a large minority. So it's what we call maybe a plurality, but it's still not the majority. And so as you chip away at the edges and as that shrinks, there is this sort of collapse that will happen to the bubble in a way that, at some point you're going to have the true believers are going to be left. They're going to stay on for as long as they possibly can. But there's 15, 20% of people who will become disillusioned. And like you said, a lot of these people are people who, one of Trump's great achievements was mobilizing the people who are not engaged in politics. So I saw a great poll that somebody did about a year or two ago, about a year and a half ago now, where they said, what is your political preference by sorting people's political preference by where do they get their political news? And so if you got your political news from newspapers, you were the most pro-Biden. Biden was still in the race at the time. You were the least pro-Trump if you got your news from the newspapers. If you got it from TV news shows, you were a little less pro-Trump. You were a little more pro-Trump. And it went down to, if you got it completely from social media, then you were more likely to, if you're getting all your news off of Twitter or Facebook, you were much more likely to be pro-Trump. But the biggest pro-Trump group was people whose response was they don't follow political news at all. And you mentioned you've got relatives who never were involved in politics, never paid any attention to it. They jumped in to pay attention to it for Trump. And so if you don't have a context of knowledge, if you haven't been following these issues, if you haven't been paying attention, if your only news sources are, I like Trump, so I started following pro-Trump people, then you're going to be sucked into this bubble. And at some point, that bubble is going to burst. There's going to be something that happens that disillusions those people. And you know what they're going to do, which I think is going to the most likely outcome? They won't admit they were wrong. They'll go back to not paying attention to politics anymore. And they'll say, all politicians lie. All those people are fake. I don't even pay attention to that. And they'll retreat from politics, which is probably the best outcome in some ways, because, if you are not taking that responsibility of learning about politics and knowing what's actually happening and looking at different sources and not just taking one source, it's probably better if you're not, highly engaged and active in promoting a viewpoint, because you're not doing the work of actually arriving at that viewpoint objectively.
So one of these people, a friend of mine, calls me one night. It's like 8:30 at night. I'm trying to watch TV, but I answer. Say, hey. He says, you come off like a leftist in a lot of your posts. And I said, dude, you just don't know what you're talking about. Please, I said, just go away with this. Stop. I mean, I'm a constitutional originalist, pro-capitalist. I couldn't be further from a leftist. I've never supported a single Democrat ever. In my life, I would have voted. I was in prison, so I couldn't, but I would have voted for W. I would have voted for McCain. I would have voted for Romney. I would have voted for Rand Paul. I would have voted for Ted Cruz over any Democrat opponent. The only one I criticized was Trump. So he says, no, I know what I'm talking about. I said, okay, well, let's just do a little test and see if you do. And I asked him, what is supply side economics? He didn't know. I said, okay, what is constitutional, strict constructionism? He didn't know the answer to that either. I then asked him about a living constitution. I said, what is that doctrine? Oh, no, first I asked him about Keynesian economics. I said, what's that? Do you know? No, never heard of it. I said, okay, what's a living constitution? He said, oh, I definitely believe in the living constitution. The Constitution is a living, breathing document. I'm like, that is such a left-wing position, but you're harassing me, telling me that I'm a leftist. This is absolutely absurd that you're doing this, but he pushes anyway. But I don't have you forever, so I want to ask you a couple more questions.
Yeah.
Every president that since I've been following politics has sought to increase their power. They've all abused their power. This is not something new. Why is Trump different?
I think there's two things that makes Trump different. One is that he is a man. I mean, the notable thing about his personality is he's a man with no internal self-restraint, right? So I think we've had a problem for at least 100 years, going back to FDR and probably to Wilson, President Wilson, and a little before even, of having what they call it the imperial presidency. This idea that the power of the presidency has been expanded and expanded and expanded, often at the expense of Congress, at the expense of the courts. And so we've had a problem with the presidency becoming too strong. And the constitutional theories sort of eroding away at the safeguards and barriers. And so when the external restraints aren't there on the president, you're really relying more and more on internal restraints and on norms and customs. And the fact that somebody is not going to, we've had some presidents who I think have been better or worse, and some I really didn't like, and some I thought had bad intentions. But I don't know that we've had somebody who was actually maliciously opposed to the American system. So you've had some people, we had presidents who pushed it because they thought, okay, I want more. They get frustrated. Every president gets frustrated. Like 2 years into their term, they get bogged down. They've lost whatever political capital they started out with. The new midterm election happens. They have a hostile Congress, and they get frustrated. And they start saying, well, how can I use the power I have? And Obama talked about, I have a pen and a phone. I can sign executive orders, and I can call up people in the administration and make them do things. So they start looking for ways they can expand their power that way. And so it's something that they typically do out of frustration because their agenda is being blocked. It's being stymied through the normal channels. And so you've had presidents do that, but I don't know you've had one who they always sort of push at the margins and the edges to try to, they need some excuse. I don't know if you've ever had one who has been as openly hostile to the American system as Donald Trump is. That I think he really, I don't think he knows what the Constitution is. He's a very unintellectual, guy. He's not somebody who studied this. But I also think he openly chafes at the idea that there's any control on his power. And he'll talk about, the only references he ever makes to the Constitution is Article 2. Article 2 gives the president complete power. That's his view of the Constitution. The Constitution is a document that gives the president complete and unlimited power to do anything he wants. And so you have somebody who I think is actively hostile to the idea of any limitations on his power, not just a guy who's going to push at the edges. So it's the lack of internal self-restraint. But the other aspect I would add to this is that there has been, I think, so I remember part of the selling point of Trumpism was he's strong and he'll do what other people didn't dare to do. And so I think what's the other thing that has always restrained presidents has not so much the Constitution or their own personal scruples. It's also, I like to think of it as mutually assured destruction. Nobody has ever gone this far before because they've been afraid of what happens when we get out of power. What happens if I knock down all the constraints? If we get rid of the filibuster, if we knock down all the constraints, if we do total rule by our party, if we create all these, absolute centralized power in one place, what happens if we lose the next election and the other side gets it? And then they use all that stuff against us. All the power we created, they use against us. And so, what if we go too far, the other side's going to want revenge. So there's been kind of a mutually assured destruction. Nobody wants to go too far because they're afraid of what happens after that, about the backlash that will come. And Donald Trump is the guy, when they say, oh, he's much bolder, he's bold and he's reckless because he's actually creating, imagine Bernie Sanders. I mean, he's too old now, but he's getting too old now. But imagine Bernie Sanders. If you want to talk about a sort of a leftist bogeyman, imagine Bernie Sanders getting all the power that Donald Trump is claiming. Imagine that he's the inheritor. Imagine that somebody like him is the inheritor of
AOC, right?
Yeah. Oh, I don't. Yeah, AOC. I mean, I'm not sure. I have a special bad. Bernie is especially on my bad list. I think he's worse than AOC. She's actually somebody strangely who's gotten better and more moderate over time. We'll see what happens. But imagine like the worst left-wing bogeyman gets all this power, what he could do with it. And I think that I'm seeing signs of fear and panic on the part of guys like Stephen Miller and the hangers-on of this administration, because I think they're terrified of what happens if they lose power, that they lose everything. They bet it all on the idea that they won one election and they're barely won one election. They bet it all on the idea that we can consolidate all this power and the American people will love us so much they'll vote us in again and again, and we will never lose another election. And that's the thing that a lot of political people who have observed politics for a long time are saying. I've been saying it. Other people have been saying it. Is these people are acting as if they are never going to lose another election. And there's two conclusions you can draw from that. One is that they're trying to rig the system so that they will, in fact, never lose another election. And I think they are trying to do that. But the other thing you could say is that they've also been incredibly foolish because the chances that they're going to succeed and that they actually are never going to lose another election is very, very small. And so this is just an incredibly stupid and self-destructive movement that they really thought, in a year and a half, we can create a complete dictatorship, so complete the American people will endorse it and they'll love it, and they'll keep and we will never lose power. I think what you're going to see actually is in the long term, this could end up being actually tremendously destructive to the entire conservative movement. And unfortunately, my fear is that's going to drag down some things that I would like, like for the cause of free markets, I think is in real serious trouble. Because we had one party that kind of talked about being in favor of free markets. And then they turned against free markets because Donald Trump wants to control everything. And then, but at the same time, they're going to turn against free markets. They're going to have Donald Trump controlling everything. But at the same time, everybody's going to blame them. Everybody's going to blame free markets on everything they do. Because we've seen this story before. I think the cause of free markets, and small government has been set back like 50 years by this. I think that's probably going to be the upshot of this, which is why I've been against Trump from the very beginning. People say you're talking like a leftist. I'm trying to save free market ideas. I've been all along saying, don't associate any idea you like. Do not associate with Donald Trump. Do not make Donald Trump your spokesman or your savior for this. Any idea that's good, don't make him a spokesman for it, because it's all going to get dragged. First of all, in the meantime, he will not give you the thing you wanted, right? Because he doesn't care about your cause. He cares about himself and his power. But after not giving you all the things you wanted out of Donald Trump, he's then going to go ahead and discredit your side for a generation. And I'm trying my best to salvage what we can out of that.
You mentioned the left.
Yeah.
And there's an argument, and I personally think it's ridiculous, but it's made by some people who are objectivists. that the left is so bad and such an evil threat that a person like Donald Trump is necessary or it's worth supporting him. What do you think of that argument?
Well, someone who says that has basically just given up on the cause of freedom. They do not think freedom is a practical cause in the world. And that's, they're admitting that. They're basically saying, we have only a choice of dictatorship. And if I'm going to choose dictatorship, I'm going to choose dictatorship run by the guy I like. Now, and furthermore, by the way, these people are not motivated by any specific cause. And that's the important thing is if you pick away at that, if you say, okay, well, if you have to choose between two dictatorships, but now, by the way, the choice of dictator, on the other side, they're creating, with the left, they're creating a bogeyman of sorts, because, even Barack Obama, of whom I was very concerned about Barack Obama. I have very low expectations for him. He didn't push executive power and centralized government power. He did not push it anywhere near this far, right? So if you're saying, Obama was a guy raised on the left, he had this radical left-wing friends, radical left-wing preacher that he followed. His mom was a leftist. He literally learned this at his mother's knee. If anybody was going to create this sort of bogeyman of the left-wing dictatorship that's going to be imposed on us, it was going to be Barack Obama. He had a much bigger, big majority in Congress. If we were going to get it, we were going to get it in 2009. We didn't get it. Now, partly it's because, there was political opposition to it, as there always is. But it was also because he did not actually do 1/10 of the stuff to create a dictatorship that Donald Trump has done. So this idea that the left is just as bad is ridiculous. But also, if you look at any specific thing that you're trying to save or achieve by supporting Donald Trump as our right-wing dictator against the left, is it free markets? Well, he's been destroying free markets. Is it free speech? He's been clamping down on free speech. If you kick down all the things that we, especially as objectivists, would value, Donald Trump, is it the freedom to not believe in God? Well, here's a guy who is the favorite candidate and the instrument of the Christian nationalists. So everything that we could possibly want, he's against. So it really, I think, comes down to, and I know some of the people you're talking about here, even though you haven't mentioned their names, it comes down to the fact that, look, if I'm going to have a dictatorship, it's going to be an outer borough guy from Queens. Right. It comes down to an aesthetic thing that he's the guy they like. He has a style and a way of speaking that they approve of. And he seems like one of their type of guys. The best line on Donald Trump, somebody once said, is that, everything he says makes more sense if you imagine that before it, you're hearing Donnie from Queens, you're on the air. Right. He's a sports radio. He's an outer borough sports radio talk show call-in guy, right? He has that style and that approach. And so I think it's really just comes down, that preference comes down to, if I'm going to have a dictator, I want a guy who's a guy from the neighborhood. And it's an aesthetic preference.
It seems that there's a couple moves that take place here. One is it's sort of the reification of a concept, where they take the left and act as if it's a monolithic entity that acts in unison, when actually you're talking about a lot of disparate views that are over there. And so they have this big threat from this imaginary thing. And I'm not saying there's not people that are on the left wing whose ideas are dangerous. There are, and I've been combating them for years. In prison, that's not exactly a right wing bastion. You know what I mean? So I was constantly arguing against this stuff. But then there's, in addition to that error, a lot of this seems to stem from what happened during COVID. And the interesting thing is, Trump is the one that instituted these things. Trump instituted the lockdowns. Trump instituted the vaccine. Trump's the guy who put pressure on the Fed to lower interest rates. Trump's the guy who signed the laws to give payments out to the American people. Trump's the guy who put pressure on Russia and Saudi Arabia to cut oil production so there wouldn't be a drop in prices. He's the guy that did it, and they just ignore that altogether and say, look what the left is doing. It's the epistemological sort of gymnastics that are done here are something the likes of which I've never seen.
So
So go ahead.
I don't buy that it's COVID, because precisely for the reasons you mentioned, that they should be mad at Trump if it was COVID. I think COVID like psychologically unhinged some people, and it made them more open to a conspiratorialist mindset, because if you didn't like what was going on in COVID, you could there's ways you could say, oh well, I think they're going too far on this and going to that, and make reasonable arguments. But a lot of people didn't do that. They said, oh well, I don't like what's going on with COVID and the shutdowns and all that, so therefore it's all a conspiracy. And so I think what happened with COVID is it pushed a lot of people over into this sort of conspiratorial thinking. And I think that's the impact that I see from COVID. Maybe I'm wrong. It's something I think historians are going to be puzzling over for decades to come, because something did happen there. I'm not sure how big and exactly.
No,
what
I agree with you there, but
Yeah.
they don't. Interestingly, they don't assign any of the blame to Trump.
Yeah. Well,
they
that's
assign it to the left.
Because they mentioned the conspiratorial thinking. It isn't Trump. It's
the globalists. The whole thing. The left.
Bill Gates using a 5G to give you whatever for mind control. But so we talk about the left. I think one root of this is one of the things, if you want to hear complaints about the far left and the sort of the problems with the far left, I hear them all the time from people who are on the left, from liberals, because if some on Blue Sky, which is sort of, different social media competitor to Twitter, smaller competitor to Twitter, it's known as sort of more of a left-leaning place. And we have complaints all the time about, the tankies, basically tankies is a term actually coined by the left to refer to the kind of people who would cheer on the Soviet tanks as they're going into Hungary or Czechoslovakia. So it's like, the funny thing is there's this difference in perspective. Like, as someone who comes out of the right, I know all the different factions of the right, and I know all the people who hate each other and go hammer and tongs at each other, and the paleo conservatives hate the neocons, and all the different beefs that people have amongst the different factions of the right. And I know that it is, or before Trump, it was this sort of the ideological diverse thing. What you have to realize is it's the exact same way on the other side, that the left is, because America's weird in the sense that we have a political system that tends to push people into two parties. And it's just the nature, it's the mechanics of our system. It's hostile to having small political parties. So in Europe, you'd have like 6 political parties, and there'd be this fringe communist party, and there'd be a fringe a slightly bigger green party, and a social democrat party that's a moderate center left, and all these different Christian Democrats who are the moderate center right. And you'd have all these things separated out. In America, we tend to get pushed into left and right, 2 monolithic blocks, because there are 2 big parties. And so these differences between the different factions aren't as visible. And so, the left is this wide-ranging thing from normie center-left people who just want, we want to preserve the welfare state as it exists right now, and really not maybe make moderate little changes over here and there, to people who want communism, right? So it's this huge difference. And so that's part of their perspective. If you've always been on the right, the differences within your own organization. The other side looks like a monolith, and there's lots of people who have an interest in making you think it's a monolith, because that allows them to push your buttons and make you believe things. And that brings me to the final thing I want to say about this, which is the general thing that I see is it's a lack of intellectual flexibility. A lot of people out there, and a lot of the people that we know mutually who are like this, I think are people who formed their conception of what politics is, and who are their friends and who are their enemies and what their loyalties are. They formed that, and what the state of the world is also. They formed it sometime in 1978 or maybe 1988, somewhere around there. And it was Republicans good, Democrats bad. Right, I have complaints about the right, but it's generally friendly. The left is horribly evil and wants to create a dictatorship. And crime is horribly out of control in the cities, and anything we can do to bring down crime, we have to do. Well, that was, in 1988, that was kind of a reasonable position. It was the peak of the crime wave, and that crime is an issue that I think reveals this, because a lot of people, I think Donald Trump, and you see it in a lot of his followers, their view of crime, and especially in the cities, was formed by watching a Dirty Harry movie sometime around 1978, right? Because there's this whole genre, about it, Dirty Harry, Death Wish. The crime wave produced its own genre of Escape from New York, that created this whole genre of the cities as hellscapes overrun by crime. And, New York City is now like one of the safest places in the world in terms of the murder rate being extremely low. so what happens is that crime wave peaked, and it's been going down for like 30 years, 30 solid years, maybe more by now. That crime has been going way down. It's going down to pre-prime wave levels, but people still have, their brains are stuck, preserved in amber, like a fossil. They have this idea of crime is out of control in the big cities, and whatever needs to be done, no matter how tough we need to get to clamp down, we need to do it. And that is, to me, is like the indicator of this lack of mental flexibility, that the facts change, but they have a viewpoint that was formed 30, 40, 50 years ago that they're not willing to change. And so they will change all their arguments. They'll change all the things that they stand for as policy, all of that, pro-free trade versus anti-free trade, all of that can change as long as they can maintain that sort of worldview of left is evil and the right is good, and whoever is and Donald Trump has been able to tap into that.
It's an interesting thing, because I read a post from David Harriman, I don't give a shit.
Yeah.
The other day, where he was talking about how he loves Ayn Rand and he hates these people who call themselves objectivists, who incessantly criticize Trump. He says, but they're whitewashing what's coming from the left. I don't know anybody that, first of all, that description applies to, that whitewashes what the left does. But the thing that I found most interesting about it is Ayn Rand, as far as I know, and I've read most of what she's written, never once tirelessly defended a single politician, ever. Never. The most she said, the best she ever did was say we should vote for Republicans because that's our best option. Right. But even that stopped once the religious right got a hold of the Republican Party. She wouldn't even support Reagan, who, when it comes to capitalism, is miles better than Trump.
Oh, on every issue. I mean, if Reagan wasn't good enough for her, the idea that she would be defending Trump is kind of ridiculous.
It's laughable. I'm not a guy. Let me just say, I am not a guy that goes to defers to the Ayn Rand said school of thought. I'm just not. I don't. When people say that, but Ayn Rand, I don't care. Make your argument. Don't tell me what Ayn Rand said about it. But when somebody says that objectivists who are doing this, they're evil or they're not objectivists, it's just like, have you ever read what the originator of objectivism actually wrote or said? Because I promise she would not be going along with what you're saying.
Right. Well, also, I mean, just on I do this on the sense of life level, because, the thing is, Ayn Rand, so one thing I would get on a soapbox about a little bit is Ayn Rand wrote in a very specific context of the mid-20th century. So, she wrote some timeless philosophical things, but the stuff that she wrote in her novels and the stuff that she wrote about politics, she wrote a lot about politics, was commentary on events, from FDR through up, maybe a little bit about Reagan, but really FDR through the 1970s. So she, if you say, well, what would Ayn Rand say? Well, she was writing in a very different context where there was different ideological dividing lines. And of course, she was also someone who escaped from the Soviet Union. So the big issue of her time was, socialism versus capitalism. The threat to capitalism was primarily from the far left, from socialism, from the Soviet Union. Right? She didn't live to see the collapse of the Soviet Union. I kind of wish she had, because I think she would have. I think she would have found a great vindication in that. It's almost a shame that she made it another 10 years, she would have seen this happen. But the thing is that people, it's the lack of mental flexibility. The political context we're in right now is not that political context. The global movement for dictatorship right now is not a communist movement. It's not even a communist movement in China, which is technically still a communist country, right? They're basically a fascist dictatorship that calls itself communist. And authoritarianism is the big global movement. And it's this very personalist, I don't even want to say it's fascist. It has a lot of overlap with fascism, but it's this personalist authoritarianism. And so one point I make in my book, when I'm talking about Trump being anti-free market, is, we think of, because of the 20th century context, we think the opposite of capitalism is socialism. But actually, when capitalism first rose, it came out of a system that was opposed to it, that wasn't socialism. It came out of feudalism and aristocracy. And it came out of this, a system in which in which a strong man or an aristocrat has all the power and rules. and capitalism came as basically a destruction of that system. And so, we think of the opposite of capitalism being socialism. There are other things that are opposed to capitalism. One of them is, I think the best way to describe Trump is patrimonialism. He actually said once, he was making this analogy about tariffs. He said, well, America's a giant store and I own the store.
Yeah.
And so that's the old-fashioned pre-capitalist system of feudalism, where it's like, the big guy, the king, owns the country, he owns everybody in it, and he has total power. And so that's an older alternative to capitalism that we're just not used to even facing up against, because it was dead in the 20th century, right? This was not a live idea that we were mostly fighting against in the 20th century. We were fighting against a different anti-capitalist viewpoint. And so I think we need to readjust our that's just a part about that mental flexibility, that the part of the reason why, going back to what Ayn Rand said, has limited utility, is that she wrote in such a different context. Now, on the other hand, she did have things that were more timeless and philosophical, and her sense of life, her approach to what human beings should be, that is more timeless and not tied to the specific, Atlas Shrugged is really her novel of the Great Depression. So, it's not tied to the specifics of what happened, but there's lots of stuff in there that's not tied to the specifics of what was happening in the 1930s in America. And so, in that regard, I would say try writing Donald Trump as a character into any of Ayn Rand's novels. Someone who looks like him and acts like him and talks like him. So I'm writing something right now where I talk about. So he had this big speech he gave to all the generals, gathered them together in Quantico, Virginia, last week, a week ago today. And he gave this speech, and there's one particular clip that I pulled out where he does this like extended riff, like a minute, talking about falling downstairs. Said Biden was falling down the stairs all the time. I'm always very careful walking down the stairs. I never want to fall. And he just, partly it's like, could you have an older man, anybody older or more ancient in this office than a guy who spends a minute talking about how he's afraid of walking downstairs, right? That's an 80-year-old guy talking, right? But also it's this guy who's absolutely obsessed with appearances. He's obsessed with it. He didn't like the way Obama went down the stairs. He bopped down the stairs. He didn't like that. And he's absolutely obsessed with, I have to look right. And if I ever appear in any way that makes me look bad, that would be horrible. The worst thing in the world. And I thought, Ayn Rand could not have written, she wrote a whole novel, The Fountainhead, where it's about the second-hander, the person who's obsessed with what other people think of him, who's only his whole existence is defined by how he appears in the eyes of others. And she would not have written this as dialogue in there, because she would have thought it was too over the top. Right? So if you write Donald Trump as a character into an Ayn Rand novel, it becomes just obvious to me, and I don't know how other people could see it, that he would not be one of the heroes. Let's put it that way.
No, he would not. All right, last question for you, Robert. Yeah. What practical steps do you think the average person can take to combat the coming dictatorship as you see it?
Well, okay, so a couple things. One is that you apparently have more free time than I do, because you spend a lot of time arguing with people on the details of a lot of this stuff. And I would say good for you, because I think people need to do that, because you have these people who are in this, they put themselves into a bubble, and as much as you can just try to keep chipping away and piercing that, it may seem you have to limit the number of hours a day you do on it, because you have a life that you want to live, I presume. But and it can be demoralizing, but chipping away at that does actually, I think, make a difference. That and eventually it will make a difference over time as more things sort of start to crumble and come down. Right? I think if we get inflation coming back and the unemployment coming back and the economy going downhill, which I think is pretty much baked into the cake at this point, then more people are going to start questioning, and people will fall away from the faith. No faith survives forever. I mean, the people raised evangelical and born and bred in it, and they know all the arguments and they can make all the arguments, and then they drift away from it, or Catholic or whatever. Every faith has people who drift away. So this is going to happen with Trumpism. The other thing I would say is, support. There are going to be people who stick their necks out and who become voices and make themselves targets. Support those people whenever you can, however you can. Even if you're not able in a position, everybody has to make a decision how much risk they can take in making themselves a target or a lightning rod. Even if you're not in the position to do that, support the people who are. And one thing I have been saying is run. I've been encouraging people to run for office. even to run for local offices, because I do think that when a lot of this stuff happens, if you're on the local school board, if a directive comes down, oh, we have to have patriotic education. This is one of Trump's bugbears, and we're going to not teach certain things and teach other things, and certain books have to be pulled off the shelves. You're on the local school board. You are in a position to throw sand in the gears on that. Or if you're in, an alderman or whatever, some local government official, we've had a lot of cases where they have ICE facilities and ICE is coming in and grabbing people off the streets, and you have local politicians who are out there and making a stink about it and putting friction and all that friction. The great thing about the American system is, and it's very much deliberately designed, it evolved that way and then they kept it by design, is that power is distributed very broadly in the American system. It's not all in Washington, D.C. That was Tocqueville wrote about the American system in Democracy in America, and he contrasts that to France. In France, everything was very highly centralized. It had been for a long time. And he actually wrote about how they overthrew the kings, and they ended up with a system that's almost exactly the same, because the structure of it was also centralized, that of course you ended up with an emperor taking the place of the king. So he talked about, and he contrasted that to America, that in America, power is spread out. It's all out there on the local level. There's a lot of things that, have to happen that aren't the central government sending a guy out to the provinces to do this. It's the provinces electing their own people, the town electing its own people. And that's a way in which, running for office for the average person is going to be like, okay, well, I'm not going to, running for Congress is a very big job. You're not going to be able necessarily in a position to do that, but you might be able to be on your school board or on some other local position where you can make a difference on these things. At the very least, by just, like I said, being sand in the gears and bogging things down and saying, no, we're not going to implement this. And you have to make us implement it. And so that's, and especially somebody who is, if you're not on the left, that's great, because you're going to be more likely to be elected and to be able to have an impact on even a conservative area if you have that credibility of, look, these are the things I've always believed, and you're going to be able to promote a more reasonable approach to politics. So there's all sorts of it's advocacy, it's support of the people who are taking substantial steps, and it's whatever you can do in the power and influence that you have, the local influence you have, that to be able to, again, power, influence, it's all widely distributed in America. So use what you have.
Robert, with this episode, I'm going to include a link to purchase your book. I'm going to include a link to your Substack. Where else can people find you?
If you go to my Substack, it's TracinskiLetter.com. The Tracinski Letter is my main Substack. That's sort of the clearinghouse for everything. But the most important thing is go buy the book.
Absolutely. Absolutely recommend
I really think that the whole point of this is I wanted to have a book that is relatively short, brisk, readable. It's about 140, 160 pages. Short, brisk, readable, that really sums up and encapsulates together everything that's happening right now, and summing up in a way I don't think anybody else has done. So I think it's the best thing I've ever written. I think it's the most important thing right now that people need to understand.
It's definitely important. Definitely recommend it. Robert, thank you so much for taking so much time out of your schedule to be with me today. Appreciate it.
Thanks you so much.
For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. Till next time.